Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can science prove that Michael Jackson was innocent? Another question I've received is, does science prove he's innocent? But that's a different question. I'll explore that a little bit in this video. Now, when I say science here in this question, I'm really talking about the scientific method, and specifically a portion of the scientific method called hypothesis testing. Now, I've covered this topic before a little bit, like I've looked at the facts of this case before, not really from the perspective of hypothesis testing. And this is a controversial case. We see allegations around for many years, and then this Leaving Neverland movie comes out, and it really focuses on two accusers. And again, like I said, I did a video on this before, and I really looked at kind of the evidence in detail. I came to the conclusion there's just no way to know, but in weighing all of the evidence, I lean a little bit more toward innocence than I do guilt. Some agree with me, some disagree with me. But either way, the question kind of comes up, can science really prove he was innocent? Or for that matter, can it prove he was guilty? Now, what's really interesting about this question is when it's applied to a case like the Michael Jackson case or situation, it's certainly something that's compelling, but really you could apply this logic to any case like this. So this isn't really specific necessarily to what happened to Michael Jackson. So back to the question, can science really prove something like this? Well, the short answer is no, and really the long answer is yes, right? So this gets a little complex and demands a bit of an understanding of how hypothesis testing works, and really how the scientific method works in general. So in terms of the short answer, which is no, science typically can't prove a negative. So I'll give you an example. There's an unusual word from the discipline of physics called syzygy, and it means when like planets align. Like typically we would use it to mean when the sun, the moon, and the earth align. I chose this word for this example because it really has no bearing on anything. It's not a controversial word, it doesn't engage a lot of emotions, and really because it's rarely used in general. So say for some reason, I don't know what this reason would be, again this is just hypothetical, it was important that you prove that during your time in grade school and high school, you never said the word syzygy. Can science prove that? Well, not really, right? Because you would have to be monitored all the time when you were in school to detect the pronunciation of that word, the saying of that word. And there's no way to do that. There's times when you would have used the bathroom, there's times when you would have moved from one classroom to another. There's just simply times when it would be very hard for somebody to have their activity recorded. So really it's impossible to prove that anybody didn't say that word when they were in school at some point. So if it was important that you didn't say that word, or to prove you didn't say that word, could you actually do it with science? Technically, no. But again, that's the short answer. The long answer, in a manner of speaking, is really yes. Because failure to prove a positive is often functionally interpreted as proving a negative. So again, with this example of syzygy, say you were trying to prove you never said it. You interview classmates. They never heard you say it. There's a video of you giving a presentation in class, or maybe several videos, and you never mentioned the word in those videos. Maybe there's some audio recordings too. You never mentioned it. Your papers and reports that you produced in school, they're all reviewed. None of them contain the word. There's no record of other terms that are similar to that being used. For example, in a physics class or an astronomy class. Or maybe there's no record that you ever took a class like that. So you didn't use the word orbit or momentum or velocity, or again, words that might be similar. You deny using that word, and perhaps you have a good reputation for telling the truth. And also you look at evidence like your opponents may be gaining something if they proved you used the word. So they have a motive for lying about you using that word, syzygy. So if evidence can't be presented that you said it, it's often assumed that you didn't say it. So the result, at least functionally, is you proved your case. You had a presumption of innocence, and the evidence could not overwhelm that presumption. But you might look at that principle, the presumption of innocence, and say, well, wait, that's about legal matters, right? That's from a court of law. not science. But actually many principles from the law and science are actually the same or quite similar. In science we have a principle called the null hypothesis, and technically it can mean a lot of things, but it's usually the hypothesis that's tested in a scientific experiment. In practice, the meaning of the null hypothesis is typically restricted to just a few different areas. The lack of a relationship between two variables. And I'm going to use the examples of depression and cognitive behavioral therapy. So depression, like major depressive disorder, psychopathology, and cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is a treatment often used for depression. So the null hypothesis would say there's no relationship between those two variables, for instance. It also says there's no causation between two variables. Like receiving CBT doesn't help somebody to feel less depressed. Now, the null hypothesis is typically tested with what we call inferential statistics. So you see that word infer kind of in the word inferential. And this is really a fancy way of saying that we don't have access to an entire population. So I can't test everybody in the world. I test a sample and I infer from that sample. That's where we get inferential statistics. These statistics usually generate what's called a p-value, a probability value. So again, using this example of CBT and depression, you have two groups of people, say 50 people in each group. One gets CBT and one gets nothing. The CBT group dramatically improves in terms of depression. So does science tell us that CBT is effective for treating depression? Well, to know this, we'd have to test the null hypothesis, that the two aren't related, that CBT and depression aren't related. And let's say the statistical analysis shows us that the probability value, that p-value I talked about before, is 2%. What does that mean? It means that there's a 2% chance that if the null hypothesis were true, so the variables are not related, that this could have occurred, the finding you had, could have occurred by random error alone. So putting this another way, there's a 98% chance that the CBT actually explained the improvement in the depression. Now that's considered to be scientifically proved, even though some people look at the word proved and think that it means you have to be 100% sure. And really you can't be unless you're using the entire population instead of a sample. And even then there are measurement errors. So science doesn't really prove something 100%. It proves something with a degree of certainty. So how do we decide how certain we need to be? Right? This is really relevant when moving back to like the Michael Jackson situation. Well, we use something called the alpha, and it's a value that we determine. It's a cutoff value. And in social sciences, it's usually about 5%. So if the p-value is less than 5%, for example, 2%, like I mentioned before, this means we reject the null hypothesis. We reject the idea that the variables are unrelated, and we accept the alternative hypothesis that says that CBT helped improve depression. So now let's connect this back to this Michael Jackson situation. If we reduce the principle of reasonable doubt, that's the standard by which somebody is convicted. They have to be found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. If we reduce that to mathematics, we see that reasonable doubt converts into a probability of around 90%. So if a jury finds a defendant guilty, usually they're about 90% sure that that person did it or more. Now this is fairly interesting because I mentioned social sciences, we have that 5% alpha, which is the same, more or less, as being 95% sure. So reasonable doubt, that standard, turns into a number fairly similar to what we use as the alpha. Now this, of course, is just how the math works out when looking at reasonable doubt. It doesn't speak to a specific case. And again, the standard isn't technically 90%. It's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, whatever that means to an individual juror. So how do we apply this specifically to the Michael Jackson case? He passed away in 2009, so of course this isn't a criminal case. It's not a case at all. There can be no finding of guilt, but people can still believe he was guilty. So we can apply it in this sense about how people think about this. So here's how it applies. I would argue that the null hypothesis is really the same thing as the presumption of innocence. Now, presumption of innocence is a legal term, and the individual who invented it was named William Blackstone. He was an English jurist. At least he's one of the first people that documented it. And he said that it's better that 10 guilty persons escape than one innocent suffer. So what he was really saying is we need a high degree of certainty, just like with what we see with the null hypothesis. What do we know about the presumption of innocence? Well, the state has the burden of proving that a crime was committed, period. So they have to prove that a crime actually occurred. And additionally, they have to prove that a defendant committed the crime. So relating this back over to science, depression exists, right? That would be what we'd have to establish first. Does depression really exist? And then secondly, does CBT help depressive symptoms improve? So it's two stages. It's not just, did somebody commit the crime? Or was a treatment effective in helping a disorder? Another principle with the presumption of innocence is the defendant bears no burden of proof. They do not have to present evidence, call witnesses, or testify. And of course, Michael Jackson can't do any of these things, although technically witnesses could step up on his behalf. But he doesn't need to do any of these things in order to be found not guilty, or to think of him as not guilty, because of course, again, he can't be found guilty. Another important point with the presumption of innocence is the fact that somebody's accused or charged is not evidence that can be considered in terms of guilt or innocence. So being accused of something actually doesn't mean anything in terms of proving guilt. From a scientific point of view, just the fact that you're asking a question doesn't mean that you now have the answer. So with all this in mind, the presumption of innocence, how it works, its similarity to the null hypothesis, where does this leave us? Why is it important that we know the answer to questions like this? Well, much of the time we really need definitive answers, but of course sometimes it doesn't matter if we know the truth or not. In criminal trials, society really does need an answer because we have a limited amount of time to figure it out, and we can't let criminal behaviors just continue without being stopped. Now, with the scientific method, we make our decisions based on carefully weighing evidence, and we're open to changing our minds in the light of new evidence. In the criminal justice system, you really can't change your mind. So because Michael Jackson is no longer alive, many would argue this topic itself doesn't matter, because whether we believe he's guilty or not, no one's going to prison, nothing's really going to happen. But actually the Michael Jackson situation speaks to a larger social issue of how we critically analyze evidence, especially in light of situations where someone can no longer defend themselves. Now, I've already provided my opinion, of course, on this matter, and I said, again, there's no way to know, but I feel like there's reasonable doubt in the situation, which means I would fail to reject the null hypothesis in this Michael Jackson situation. However, I can understand how people could be in any of the three popular categories, believing he's guilty, believing he's innocent, and not knowing. It's not a matter of good people versus bad people, or illogical people versus logical people. But again, it just sheds light on how we apply critical thinking. How certain do we need to be before we say something's true? And how it's difficult sometimes to make this determination. Now, this issue of certainty is really important. Science seeks to prove something. It tries to determine something with a high level of certainty. And this is not ideal for every situation. For example, if you were going to loan your car to somebody, and then you found out there was a 1% chance that they were going to steal it, would you still give them the keys? Are they probably going to steal it? No. But a 1% risk is still too high. It's still too great. And that risk is unnecessary. So if somebody exactly like Michael Jackson were alive today, would someone be rational in saying that they don't want to leave their children with him? Of course, because even a small risk of offending is too high. So the scientific method, specifically hypothesis testing, is useful for some purposes, but not in others. So to answer that original question, the answer, of course, as I mentioned, is both yes and no. But perhaps another important question would be, how certain do we need to be in various situations? So if we're going to substitute, for example, one effective treatment for another, like if we're going to replace CBT with a new experimental treatment, how certain would we need to be to take away CBT and put in a new treatment? Well, we'd have to be very certain because we know CBT is relatively effective. And we could hurt people if we take that away and put in an unproven treatment. But moving over to the area of crime, how certain do we need to be to believe somebody's guilty of a crime? Well, at a personal level, everybody decides that for themselves, just like that example with loaning somebody your car. But at a societal level, we use science to determine if somebody's guilty of a crime, because we want a high degree of certainty. We want to make sure that when we accuse somebody and follow through by charging somebody, that they really did it. So it's not like a 1% thing. A 1% certainty would certainly not be enough to say that somebody committed a crime. We want to be very certain. And I think that really speaks a lot to, again, how we critically analyze the situation with Michael Jackson. As a society, we have to decide how certain do we want to be to say that somebody actually committed a crime, or committed any activity for that matter. So I know whenever I talk about the Michael Jackson case, there are going to be a lot of strong opinions. Some people will agree with me or disagree with me, and specifically even with the scientific method and how I conceptualize it, some people will agree and disagree. Please put your different opinions in the comment section. They really generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this description of the Michael Jackson case and hypothesis testing to be interesting. Thanks for watching.